This is the third lesson in the series of lessons on the book of Acts. As we said before, of course, we cannot cover the whole book, so we'll be picking and choosing certain texts that we'll be teaching from. In this one, we're going to be looking at the first 7 verses in Acts chapter 6. This is a text that provides a great example and illustration of how to handle problems in churches. As we all know, the churches often experience problems. We're dealing with people, and anytime you're dealing with people, you're going to have problems. And so, this is a great example of an illustration of how to handle those problems. The early church was growing both numerically and spiritually. The time of this was probably about 5 years after the establishment of the church. Some people think it was a little less, maybe 3 or 4 years. Other people think it was a little more, maybe 7 or 8 years. So, somewhere in the range of 5 years or so. We do not know for sure, and it doesn't really matter. But we see the church was growing, and of course, anytime the church is growing and new people are coming in, likely you're going to have problems. Even with the best leadership, people fall through the cracks and sometimes problems develop. In this case, we find some Hellenist widows that were being neglected and that complaint arose. Of course, these were Greek speaking Jews who had scattered to other nations. These people had probably come in for Pentecost, and many of them probably stayed. Many of them maybe lived in Jerusalem, but they had started speaking Greek mainly. And the native Jews kind of looked upon them or looked down upon them as people who had compromised their Jewish faith. And so there was a great divide between the native Jews who continued to speak Aramaic, which is a derivative of Hebrew, and those who had adopted heathen ways, so to speak, as they thought, and started speaking the Greek language. Normally, these two groups kept their distance from one another. And this shows the power of the gospel because now in the church we have both of these groups all meeting together and they were united. But of course, we did have some problems. And of course, as we said, Hellenist widows were being neglected. As we know, the early church helped many of the poor saints, and Paul gives some guidelines about how to take care of the poor widows who needed the assistance of the churches. And so here was, we have no idea how many, of course, but how many widows were being cared for by the church. And so here we're going to first look at some good principles, that leadership principle we see illustrated here. One is that good leaders handle problems at once. You see, the apostles, of course, at this time acted as the leaders of the church. And these apostles could have simply acted as if the problem did not exist. Or they could have taken the complaint personally. They could have said, well, you're complaining about us. We're busy doing all of these things. We shouldn't have to be distracted by this. We shouldn't have to be taking care of these things. Because they didn't do either one of those. It does show us that leaders should not be distracted, though, from their primary responsibilities. You see, no one can do everything. So good leaders handle problems, and good leaders delegate responsibility. As we said, no one can do everything, so therefore no one should try to do everything. Apparently, here it seemed as if the apostles were basically trying to do everything. And we see, of course, they probably failed a little bit in doing that. Now, I do not believe that the apostles in any way intentionally neglected the widows. Now, of course, some people would say they did, but I just do not see that. We find no indication of that whatsoever in the text. And so I don't think the apostles intentionally neglected. They just probably had too much going on. They could not see after everything. And so in verse 2, we find the apostle said, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Now, this does not mean, of course, that the apostle thought they were too important for this lowly task of serving tables. Now, in our day and time, sometimes we might get that impression because that's the way we talk sometimes. We talk as if serving tables or doing manual labor, oh, that's not important. Uh, Preachers are too important to handle such lowly tasks as that. Well, that's not the meaning of this text. The apostles were not saying that that task was too unimportant or too lowly for them. They were simply saying that their main duty was to prayer and ministry of the word. And naturally, it should be because they were the inspired prophets. They were the inspired apostles. Anyone could serve tables. Not everyone could preach at that time because not everyone had the inspiration of the Spirit by any means. And so the apostles should be doing what they were designed to do and what they were empowered to do, and that is preach the gospel. Let other people do the job of serving tables and taking care of the widows. So good leaders delegate responsibility. As we said, no one can do everything. Therefore, good leaders delegate the responsibility, delegate certain tasks to other people who can handle those things better than what they could themselves. And then we find that good leaders involve the congregation. Now, we do not know exactly how they did this. The congregation probably numbered into the thousands by now, because we do not know how many, but we know it's up in the thousands of members. But we find the apostles showing trust in the congregation. You know, some leaders do not trust their followers. They act as if they know more than anyone else, and they're afraid to trust anyone with certain responsibilities. Or even if they did trust them, they would always be looking over their shoulders to make sure they didn't mess anything up and were doing it right. Well, if you're going to do that, that's not really delegating responsibility, is it? So the apostles showed trust in this congregation. Other passages speak of the appointment by leaders, but this is the only one in which that indicates exactly how leaders are to be appointed. Now, people often look to like for instance, the passage in Titus where Paul encouraged Titus to appoint elders in every church to set in order the things that were lacking. And so many people take the impression that Titus were to go around and just simply appoint to leaders. Well, there's no indication that Titus was simply to appoint whoever he wanted to. Since this is the inspired example of how the early church did appoint leaders, certainly I think this is one we should try to follow ourselves. And that is, let the congregation have a part in choosing its own leaders. If anyone was ever qualified to do the selecting, you would think it would have been the Spirit led apostles. But even the apostles did not appoint the leaders for the congregation. They simply said to the congregation, you do the selecting. So somehow we should let the congregation have a part in selecting its own leaders. So good leaders involve the congregation. And then the good leaders also put the right people in the right jobs. Notice the apostle said to choose 7 men. Now, of course, you might ask why the number 7, and of course, we do not know that either. There have been several suggestions, but that's all they are, just suggestions. So we're not going to get involved in trying to point out why 7. But the point is, he did say select 7 men. The selecting was not to be a popularity contest. We find that these men were chosen for their not for their special organization or leadership skills, but they were chosen for their qualifications, which were mainly inward. They were chosen for their spiritual qualifications. Anyone who is going to lead a spirit church must be spiritual people. You cannot be a spiritual leader if you're not a spiritual person yourself. And so these were to be 7 men. God has always planned for the church to be led by men. Men should occupy the positions of leadership. But we find these men also were to have servant hearts. That was their job. Their job was to serve tables. Their job was serving. Now, this is the same word from which we get the word deacon. And the question is often asked then, well, were these the first deacons? I think it's best to simply look upon this as a special arrangement, probably temporary, and later replaced by the elders and the deacons. This word can be used in many places and often is used in many places in the New Testament simply to refer to a servant. So it's like the word elder. Sometimes it refers simply to an older person. Sometimes it does refer to the special office of the elder in the church. Well, the word deacon or servant is much the same way. Sometimes it refers to the special office of a deacon in the church, but oftentimes it refers to simply be a servant. And so I think that's the best way to look at it here. Is not look upon these as the first deacons, but simply as special servants of the church. Probably a temporary job, a temporary arrangement. But we find some characteristics of these individuals. As we said before, this was not a popularity contest. Uh, also laid down some strict guidelines for which they should follow. One, they were to have a good reputation. That is, they were to be respected by all the members of the congregation. Naturally, you want a leader who has the respect of the people. If they do not have the respect of the people, then obviously they cannot lead. And so these must have a good reputation. They were also said to be full of the Holy Spirit. This simply means be under the control of the Spirit. There's no indication that this referred to miraculous abilities. Up to this point in time, we find no record of anyone other than the apostles performing miracles. And so it seemed best to simply refer to these people as spiritually mature individuals. Now, later we do read of some of them performing miracles, such as Philip in Acts chapter 8. But this was after they had their hands laid on them by the apostles. So to be full of the Holy Spirit doesn't mean they had miraculous powers. Just simply means they were spirit-led individuals. And then they were also to be full of wisdom. All Christians full of wisdom. Full of wisdom means to be good judgment or common sense. All Christians should possess all of these characteristics. I think that's important to realize too. These are not some specialized characteristics, but these are simply things that all Christians should exhibit. We do find that all of these men had Greek names, which probably indicate they were Greeks. Naturally, they would better be able to relate to the Grecian widows and that part of the church. And then next we find that good leaders emphasize the importance of assigned tasks. Again, they did not mean to denigrate the job of serving tables as if that was some kind of inferior task. The very fact they called for a special meeting showed that they considered this to be an important job. Caring for widows is stressed throughout the New Testament. For instance, in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus painted a picture for us of the last judgment. And he pointed out in the last day, many are going to be lost. Why? Because they did not care for the widows. They did not care for the poor and so forth. James emphasized in James chapter 1 and verse 25, pure and undefiled religion for God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Now, of course, to visit the orphan doesn't mean to just simply go by and say hi and how you're doing. To visit means to care for them and to give them whatever they needed. You see, there are no big jobs and little jobs in the church. You remember Jesus said, whoever gives a cup of cold water in my name will no wise lose his reward. So whatever a job might be doing is meaningful. No matter how small it might be, Now, in my thinking, a cup of cold water is about as small a job as anyone could do. But even Jesus said, even if that's what you do, God will see it and God will reward you. You see, those things done so called behind the scenes is as essential to the work at the church as anything done in public. Because if those jobs behind the scenes are not done, then certainly it will distract from the public jobs that we often think is so important. There are no unimportant jobs in the church, and good leaders emphasize the importance of all tasks. And then we see the good leaders enjoy the trust and support of the congregation. We find here that after it's all done, that the whole thing pleased all the congregation. Now, it's been jokingly said that this is one of the greatest miracles in the Bible. That whole congregation was pleased with it. You know, it seemed like there's nothing you can do to please everybody. And that seems like the way it is many times. It don't matter what you do, some people are not going to like it. But apparently here, the whole congregation liked what they did. Now, of course, there might have been a few isolated individuals that did not really care for it, but as a whole, the whole congregation was pleased. And they were pleased because the apostles handled the situation with sensitivity and sensibility. Good leaders handle the problems in the right way. They show the love and respect to the congregation. And when leaders shows love and respect to the congregation, usually it will be responded to in turn. And so they finally appointed the 7 men. Now again, we're not told exactly how these 7 were chosen. As we said, we know it was not a popularity contest, and it doesn't really matter, but somehow again the whole congregation were involved in the choosing. Now, of the 7 chosen, we don't know anything about them except for 2, Stephen and Philip. And of course, Stephen and Philip we find very prominently in the next couple of chapters. Stephen, of course, was the first Christian martyr found in the very next chapter. According to tradition, Prochorus was martyred in Antioch. Of course, we don't know whether that's true or not, but of the others, we don't know anything at all about them. But these men were placed in front of the congregation in some kind of ceremony that impressed upon their minds and the congregation of the seriousness of their task. This let the congregation know that these men were now in charge of distributing the food. And whenever we appoint people to certain offices, whether it's the elders, deacons, or any office, I think it's good to put them in front of the congregation so the whole congregation will know exactly what these men are in charge of doing. And so they put them in front of the congregation. They began with prayer. Anytime a new work is begun, it is certainly appropriate to begin with prayer. And then the apostle laid their hands on them. Now, hands were laid on people for a variety of reasons in the New Testament. Sometimes they bestowed a blessing, sometimes it was to heal, sometimes simply to appoint to an office and confer authority, and sometimes it was to give the power to perform miracles. In this case, it seems it was likely for more than one reason. It was first to appoint them to an office, the office of caring for the Grecian widows. But since later we find Stephen and Philip performing miracles, I think we could also say that they also received the power of the Spirit to perform miracles by the laying on of hands. And so after this was done and the problem taken care of, the result was the church continued to grow and continued to spread. You see, when problems are handled correctly, the work of the church is not harmed, but it actually helped. Problems we know hurts the church. But problems, unless they cannot really hurt, unless they are not handled right. We cannot completely avoid problems, but we can avoid not handling the problems correctly. And so we find good illustrations of the principles of leadership here. And I think that's one thing we want to look at this lesson is look at the principles of leadership that we all need in our day-to-day lives. So after the problem was handled, the church continued to grow. The number of disciples continued to multiply rapidly. And then we might also find a surprising statement here. Many of the priests were also obedient in verse 7. Now, of course, most likely these were not the chief priests who were leaders of the persecution. It had been estimated that there were 8,000 Jewish priests. Some say there were many more than that. But let's say there were at least 8,000 Jewish priests attached to the temple service there in Jerusalem. Now, that's a lot of priests, isn't it? Obviously, they were not all busy all the time. They would take turns doing the work of the priest there at the temple. And they considered it a great honor to be able to do that. But many of these priests apparently believed in what was done and they were converted to the church. A key lesson is, as we've already said, is that the church will prosper when everyone does his or her part. We find the apostles doing their part of leading the church. We find them handling the problems when they developed, even though probably they had nothing they could do about the problem. They just kind of fell through the cracks. Once they realized what the problem was, they took care to address the problem and solve it. And they appointed leaders, other leaders in the church to handle that particular problem. And they involved the congregation in the selecting of these individuals. Congregations should select their own leaders, but not just everybody, or anybody rather, but they gave certain guidelines that they should choose and by which they could choose these men. And when this is done correctly, then the church will continue to grow. So hope that this lesson will give us a little insight into how to handle problems in the church of the day and how to appoint the leaders of the church, because every church must have leaders. And so hopefully this will give you kind of guidelines about how to handle and point the leaders in the church and handle the problems that might develop. Thank you.